please. And could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we invite you to use the chat to identify yourself and your organization. Again, we're delighted that so many of you are here from such a diverse range of locations. So again, welcome, and we'd love to just kind of get a quick look at who's actually with us today. We'll move on with introductions, but again, Larry is the director. Carlos runs the internship program as program manager. I coordinate research and educational outreach at the Ferry Box Center. Next slide, please. So just to preview today's agenda, Larry in just a moment will give you a little bit more context about our work at the Gregory Ferry Box Center. As you'll hear, while we work specifically with college students with physical disabilities, we are committed to and engaged in bettering the career preparation for individuals with any type of disability going through higher education. So we look forward to giving you a little bit more information about that today. In addition to the slides, you'll also be getting a resource handout from us, which will give you access to a lot more information as well. Carlos will be talking with you about the benefits of building and sustaining, particularly in these days, an inclusive and accessible workplace culture. But we'll also talk a little bit today about the growing challenges for doing that. We'll drill down and we'll give you an opportunity to hear a brief interview that Carlos recently conducted with Hope Trentadue, a former intern of ours who's now employed full-time with a disability. And Hope will tell you a little bit more about how these issues played out for her in both an internship experience and now that she's employed full-time. Toward the end, Larry will make a variety of recommendations to you by going through 3 or 4 slides with you that again have more links and resources about different ways you can just holistically embed your practices with approaches that increase accessibility for all, but particularly for individuals with a variety of disabilities. With that, let me turn it over to Larry to give you more background now about our work at the Ferry Box Center.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. And again, we just really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you for joining us in this discussion. So, I mean, who are these 3 guys talking to you today? What is the Ferry Box Center? So a little bit about us. Everything we do at the Gregory S. Ferry Box Center in Indianapolis is built around the idea that we want to promote successful employment outcomes for college students who have some form of a physical disability. We define physical disability as being disabilities that are mobility, orthopedic, visual, and hearing related. We are named after a gentleman named Greg Ferrybach. Greg pictured on the screen. Greg's an attorney in Indianapolis. It's a person with a disability. Greg has a national profile. He recently served 2 terms on the United States Access Board, which is an appointment by the president. Greg's term ended at the end of the last administration. Greg is very well connected, not just in Indiana, but nationally. And so what is now the Ferry Box Center began maybe 15, 16 years ago through a connection with Ball State University in Indiana. So I was the director of disability services at Ball State. Carlos was in charge of assistive technology for students, faculty, and staff at Ball State. Greg Ferrybach, a Ball State alum, who was very gracious in his time and money to support Ball State students with disabilities. Ball State, a national reputation with being a disability-friendly campus. Lots of students with physical disabilities have graduated from Ball State. Greg asked me a question 15, 16 years ago. How come I never see people with disabilities in leadership positions, boards, etc.? And then the follow-up question is, what can we do about it? We realized through talking to many alums and students at Ball State that our students with physical disabilities were graduating at very high rates, but they were often struggling to find equitable employment after graduation. And we learned a variety of reasons, that there were a variety of reasons behind that, but a critical reason was that students with disabilities were not connecting with career services, and specifically they weren't doing internships. And so we all know how important internships are. And so to we started a little program utilizing Greg's connections in Indianapolis, um, a program that was just initially internships, paid internships for Ball State students with physical disabilities. The thing worked, it grew, it continued to grow. It grew to the point where Eskenazi Health in Indianapolis, where the Ferry Box Center is housed, asked Carlos and I if we would leave Ball State, develop this into a center, start recruiting students with physical disabilities from around Indiana and now beyond, and start recruiting additional employers to host interns from the program. So to date, we've had 475 internships that we've offered to 228 students. We've had 42 different colleges represented. We've had 46 different employers host Ferry Box Center interns. Global companies like Eli Lilly, the large pharmaceutical headquartered in Indianapolis, Cummins, large engine manufacturer, hospitals, museums, etc. So we've had a variety of different employers host Ferry Box Center interns. We've received some wonderful attention nationally. We had the great honor last year of being selected as the recipient of the Chevron Innovation Award from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And the Association on Higher Education and Disability asked us if we would um, lead a special issue of its academic journal, the JPED, last year. And so we had a bunch of research about Ferry Box Center that was published in this special issue of the JPED, which is on the screen if you'd want to look more into that. So again, everything we do at the Ferry Box Center promoting successful employment outcomes for college graduates with physical disabilities. Next slide, please. With our internship program being the bedrock of what we do. We had 65 interns last summer in the internship program. We anticipate we'll have a similar number this year. Pictured on the screen is, I think, about 60, 65 interns from a gathering that we did in Indianapolis with Greg Ferrybach pictured in the middle. And so we do a variety of professional development opportunities and events for our interns. For students who are coming outside of the Indianapolis area, we provide housing free of charge to them. We provide free transportation. So everything we're doing is trying to remove barriers that students with physical disabilities may have to accessing good internships that hopefully put them in a position for gainful employment after graduation. We do all kinds of presentations, work with colleges and universities to better connect disability and career services. Dr. Parker heads up our research initiatives. We have a research advisory board with people from around the country who were able to fund research projects that essentially outline best practices in better engaging students with disabilities in the career development process, and look at some of the barriers and address some of the answers to those barriers that are faced. Our goal eventually is through the practice and the research is to have an impact on public policy, as there's some real disincentives to gainful employment for graduates with disabilities. So that is a relatively brief overview of the work we do at the Ferry Box Center. We'll go to the next slide and I will turn it over to my colleague, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Larry, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'd like a little interaction, if you wouldn't mind. We have this prompt that feel free. We ask you to share your thoughts in the chat about what are the benefits of creating an accessible workplace culture that includes people with disabilities. Feel free to enter this into the chat, your responses, and we'll give a couple minutes. My colleague, Dr. Parker, has graciously agreed to monitor the chat. We'll just give a minute here to see what your thoughts are. Again, what are the benefits of creating an accessible workplace culture that includes people with disabilities? Dr. Parker, do we have any responses so far?
We do, Carlos. People are already replying. It benefits everyone because of universal design. Thank you, Jamie. Lindsay Universal design again comes up. Vivian writes, it's mission critical for us uh, to do our work in the city and area plans as well. Sarah added perspectives that would otherwise be missed. These are all great benefits. Um, it's an inclusive approach where we can all learn from and benefit from other people. Thank you all. Please continue to post. These are great ideas. You can take a look at them and better understand what your colleagues are experiencing and thinking about. Carlos, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. These are wonderful responses. Wow, you're all doing such great work. We wish there were more people who took this very seriously as you all do. This is great. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the benefits that employers have when it comes to hiring individuals with disabilities. So oftentimes individuals who have disabilities are an overlooked talent pool when it comes to considering individuals for open positions within an organization. Um, However, we always say, hire the best person for the job. And that may include an individual with a disability. This is by no means charity work for a business or organization to hire an individual with a disability. You should always hire the best person for a position, but don't overlook people with disabilities. But the benefits are numerous, including the fact that people with disabilities often bring a perspective that people without disabilities may not necessarily have. I'm an individual who's blind, and certainly there are certain things that come up that may not be as accessible as perhaps it hopefully would be otherwise. But coming up with alternative ways to get from place to place or to access information is something that I practice in my personal daily life. And I know that several individuals with disabilities also figure out ways around any obstacles that they may encounter. So problem solving is a big a skill that oftentimes individuals with disabilities are utilizing on a daily basis to get around and circumnavigate things that may not otherwise be as accessible to them. Oftentimes, individuals with disabilities are loyal employees. We know how important it is for organizations to minimize turnover. And so individuals with disabilities can be motivated and loyal employees as well for several organizations. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to look at some other challenges and thinking about what can complicate the creation of an inclusive, accessible workplace culture. So if you would, please put your thoughts in the chat. Again, what can complicate the creation of an inclusive, accessible workplace culture? Seems like a lot of you are doing some great work. I'm sure it hasn't been a smooth and easy path along the way to the work that you're doing, and there's certainly some challenges I'm sure that continue. So, Dr. Parker, are there any thoughts to this prompt so far?
Lack of voices at the decision-making table. Thank you, Lajaya. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I apologize if I didn't, but what a great point.
Very important. Yeah. Feel free to continue any thoughts you may have. This is several organizations want to do the right thing, but sometimes there's just complicating factors along the way. It's not as easy as we all hope it would be.
That's right, Carlos. Rebecca added accommodation requests are so involved. You mentioned technology barriers. Monica, understanding of accessing resources for accommodations. Right. It's complicated, particularly when you're going through it for the first time. We hope that, again, some of the information we share today can enrich your access to more information about how to do that at a relatively straightforward manner that typically does not cost very much.
Wow, what an important point. Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Those are all great and important thoughts. Next slide, please. So yeah, looking at some of the challenges, some that have already been mentioned, sometimes there's just a lack of disability awareness and individuals, coworkers, supervisors, hiring managers, may be unfamiliar and uncomfortable with interacting with individuals with disabilities. And so that can certainly be a challenge. Just preconceived notions of disability. So I know for me, being an individual who's blind, oftentimes, people wonder, how's this person going to get around in my building, in my facility? How is this person going to access email and digital information on a computer? But there are ways. There's great technology. Technology was just mentioned. I'm glad that was mentioned. Thank you. Technology can be such a great leveling equalizer, and it's not always great. And we have accessibility challenges, but in general, accessible technology can mean the difference between an individual who has a disability being employed or not, being able to perform a job function. So I use a screen reader, and yeah, on my computer that reads the screen. And a lot of people don't realize the technology exists, but that's how I use a computer. I'm able to learn how to navigate spaces as an individual who's blind, so that's not a concern. But for those who have preconceived notions, that can certainly be a barrier. Um, Also, other barriers include just the fear of some sort of retaliation by an individual, an employee with a disability. Something isn't provided in such a manner that you know that allows that individual to thrive in their environment. There could be a fear of retaliation or a lack of accessibility in the workplace. We talked about technology, but also physical spaces, making sure that spaces, doorways, elevators, and just the physical spaces are accessible are as important as the digital accessibility as well. So that could also be a challenge from the employer perspective. And then one thing that I think that was really important that was mentioned in the response to the last prompt about accommodations. Oftentimes there's a misconceived notion that accommodations are going to be complicated and expensive, but that's not actually the case. The majority of accommodations are little to no cost and are not difficult to implement. So that's one thing also that can be a challenge for employers. Next slide, please. There are some challenges from the employee's perspective as well. At the Ferry Box Center, we're working with undergraduate college students who are degree-seeking students, but oftentimes the students with disabilities that we interact with don't take full advantage of career preparation offered by the career service offices on their college campuses. So these offices, of course, help with resumes, interview tips and skills, and several other things to help students prepare for jobs. And without taking advantage of those services, resumes just aren't as strong. The interview skills may not be as strong. So this is certainly one thing that we've noticed as that students aren't fully engaging in services that can benefit them in their career preparation. Disclosing a disability for somebody with a disability can be a big obstacle to navigate, for fear that if disclosing the disability to an employer perhaps could lead to the reason they're denied or turned down from an offer. Not everybody needs to disclose a disability. If the disability isn't impacting the work that's being done, they may not need to disclose the disability. But if they need an accommodation, it's certainly good to disclose the disability, work with human resources and the proper channels within the organization to obtain the necessary accommodations. Accommodations, by the way, they're not designed to give unfair advantages to people with disabilities. They're intended to level the playing field. So that's the whole reason somebody might want to disclose a disability to acquire those accommodations to help them be as productive as possible. And then one other thing I want to mention is just not participating in internships. That's what gives students, especially college students, the skills and the experiences that are going to lead to that next level and hopefully landing that full-time employment opportunity. So internships are critical, as Larry mentioned earlier, to building those experiences that'll lead to that next stage. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to hear from an expert. Hope Trinidou is a former intern through the Ferrybox Center who you'll hear from her. She graduated from college and now she's a full-time employee with an organization called Ascend Indiana. So I'll pause and let you listen to this interview that I had the honor of conducting with Hope, and then we'll return after the video.
Question, Carlos, were we hoping to watch the whole video?
Yes.
Okay.
It's roughly 10 minutes in length. So yeah, but I think you'll enjoy this. Hello, my name's Carlos Taylor, Program Manager of the Gregory S. Ferrybox Center, where we facilitate paid internships for college students with physical disabilities. I have the pleasure of speaking with one of our former interns today, Hope Trinidou. Hello, Hope.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thanks for joining me. So we're just going to have a brief conversation about your internship experiences and to see how that helped you along your career path. But before we begin with questions, would you mind just giving a brief introductions? What city you're from, what college you attended, your major, and where you interned?
Sure. So I'm Hope Trinidou. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I went to Grace College and Seminary for communication with a minor in information systems. So I have my bachelor's now, and I interned at both Ascend Indiana and Cummins.
Great, thank you. And again, before we start, just a couple additional questions. You're no longer an intern. Could you briefly describe what you're doing now?
Sure. So I graduated in 2023, and now I am a manager of workforce strategies at Ascend Indiana. So basically helping our employers and our students to find each other on the Ascend network.
Excellent. As I mentioned, the Gregory S. Ferrybox Center facilitates paid internships for college students with some form of physical disability, being hearing, vision, orthopedic, or mobility related. Hope, would you care just to briefly describe the nature of your disability?
Sure. So I am legally blind. I have a bit of remaining vision, but not perfect vision.
Great, thank you. I think that'll help the audience understand the context as we have our discussion. So, starting with our questions, prior to your internship experience, did you have any concerns about how you would approach questions about disability accommodations with an employer?
So I actually did because I was so used to, talking to teachers and talking to professors and doing that kind of in the education world. And I didn't really know how those like mandated accommodations would transfer over to the workforce when I was no longer protected by a disability services program at college or whatever. And so I was having some concerns about, when I disclose my disability so that people will give me a chance or review my resume or even let me have an interview. And then making sure to try to understand how I can talk about my disability in a way that is going to be honest, but is also going to allow me to show off my strengths and be able to get into that job.
Makes sense. I know a lot of students have that concern as well. So thank you for sharing that. What, if any, barriers did you encounter during your internship experiences?
So I had a few barriers just with, again, I think that I came from an environment where everyone knew my disability. I had friends, I had professors. And so going into a new workplace where maybe they already knew that I was a Farabach intern, so they kind of knew the background that I was coming to them from this program that helps people with physical disabilities. But then the barrier was trying to, work with the team to try to get those accommodations in place, or to try and figure out how virtual trainings and stuff was going to take place. And so learning, oh, well, maybe because I can't see my manager's screen when she's sharing her screen, we had to walk through how to problem solve that issue so that I could still learn my tasks. And so we decided that instead of her sharing her screen, I would share my screen. And that's how we worked through that. Or just, there were a couple of service dog things as well. So I have a guide dog, and just trying to explain my way around that as I came up with a few of the like service dog access issues and things like that. But again, we worked through that really well. And it all turned out okay. But just some interesting barriers that I think, because I went through those during my internship, I was more prepared when I came out of college.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. Great. What type of accommodations do you use in a workplace setting, Hope? Do you use any sort of assistive technology tools or anything to help you do the job that you do?
So I really only use Windows Magnifier. It's typically all I need. I set it to like 700%, so it's enlarging my screen pretty big, which can also be a challenge because it means that I can only see like an inch or two of the screen at a time. But that's the only real assistive technology that I need. And then just, a couple of accommodations from my team, like sometimes if we have a large group meeting, if we have a full Ascend team meeting, instead of just sharing the PowerPoint on the screen, they'll send me the link to the PowerPoint document so that I can open it up on my computer and look at it because I can't see it on the large screen. Or just things like that that are kind of accommodations. But the only real assistive technology that I use is Windows Magnifier.
Right, makes sense. But the accommodations you mentioned are not very rigorous to implement. Just simply emailing a link is a pretty simple accommodation to provide.
Yes.
That's great. What do you think your employers or your coworkers learned about you during your internship experiences?
I think they learned more about disabilities, and I think they learned more about just, the workplace for disabilities. And even as I work full-time with Ascend, because I was an intern for them, I'm still thinking of ways that we can make the office space more accessible and things like that. And because I've worked for them as an intern and now I'm full-time with them, it's amazing to have that open dialogue. And so I can come up with things like, oh, I see that these things are labeled. Why don't we label these in Braille as well? Because I know that, like, for me, that would be really helpful. And I'm hoping that we're able to hire more people who are blind or low vision, things like that. So I definitely am helping, I think, my co-working space to kind of become more accessible as we progress into the future and things like that. And then also, I think one of the things that we learned together as a team, especially during my internship, was how to problem solve, with the screen sharing things and just things like, okay, you say that it's going to take this long to do this task, but because I have my screen enlarged to 700%, it's going to take me slightly longer. And so thinking through, do we need to cut down on some of my goals just so that I'm able to keep up with the team and get the work done, but it's not going to reduce the amount of work that we do as a team. So I think we learned a lot about problem solving. We learned a lot about just working as a team together. I think they also just learned more about disability as a whole. And then we also just learned, more about having a more accessible environment for work.
That's excellent. Excellent. Thank you. And, interns, regardless of disability, have, learning experiences, throughout their internships. That's what internships are for. But also, I lead into my final question here, what do you think is the most powerful thing you learned about yourself during your internships?
I think the thing that I learned over and over again, and the thing that I still continue to learn, is that I do have the answers to the questions that I ask. And sometimes it's okay to like sit in that ambiguity and think through something before bringing it to my coworker. And one of the most satisfying things about my internship and then also transferring into my full-time role was thinking of a problem, trying to ask questions, and then being like, oh, actually, I found the answer, never mind, and having to tell my manager that I had the answer already. And so just things like that, where I just learned like I can have confidence in myself to know the answer to a question, but then also it's okay for me to go and ask my team if I need the help. And sometimes it's great to just sit and problem solve it with your team and to say, okay, here are the solutions that I brought to the table. What are your thoughts on that? And so just collaborating as a team and working through different problems and solutions is always awesome.
Excellent. Wow, that's great, Hope. Thank you so much for your time and sharing about your experiences and how that transitioned to the work you're doing today. That's great. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time and we will we'll wrap this up and leave it at that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, so that's Hope Trinidad, our former intern, who's now fully employed or full-time employee at Ascend, Indiana. So just want to just quickly point out, so she mentioned, Windows magnifiers and accommodation. That's something that's included with Windows. So there's no expense to providing a Windows magnifier. So the low-cost solution again for the accommodation and just providing slides and things to her so she can see them on her own device as opposed to a large screen in a meeting. So again, just low cost solutions, but really important accommodations for somebody like Hope. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Larry to talk about some recommendations.
Thank you, Carlos. And I'm going to just summarize a few slides of recommendations that we have here so we can leave at least 5 minutes for Q&A before we wrap up. Really interesting study on college interns experience gave some terrific information for us. And one of the recommendations is something that we know, not just through research, but also through lived experience over 25 years of working with college students with disabilities, is that there's often a disconnect on campus between disability services and career services, and that students with disabilities often don't participate in the career development activities offered by career services. So the key recommendation here is good, thoughtful, intentional career advising for students with disabilities, making sure that those two offices partner together so students with disabilities can get connected to career development activities. Also, virtual internships have been terrific for a lot of people, including individuals with disabilities. They've opened up doors to work that wasn't there before for a variety of reasons. However, we're seeing less options remotely now, and in many places going back to on-site. Remote has been great, but when people are doing remote virtual internships, there's not as much interaction with supervisors and coworkers. So there's good and bad there. Next slide, please. Good communication is essential for any workplace, right? This is especially important for the individual with a disability. The person with a disability needs to have that relationship with their supervisor so that they can share ideas, they can talk about possible accommodations or workarounds like Hope described. One thing that we often say is, if there's questions that a supervisor might have, is to ask the expert. I mean, the three of us, can talk about these things. We're not the experts. The expert is the person with a disability. They have the lived experience. They know what has worked best for them. So we certainly encourage open, honest, thoughtful communication between supervisors and employees with disabilities. Next slide. And again, I'm running through these really quickly. There's a lot of really good information here. You're going to have access to the slides. So I'm just giving a brief summary of these. So good following disability etiquette, knowing what you can and can't ask relative to disability in the interview stage is critical. And I guess I would say a couple things here. Don't make assumptions. You may have known somebody previously who was blind, for example. Don't make the assumption that because this one person who was blind did something this way, that all people who are blind do it that way. That's the accommodations that they may need. So don't make assumptions. And I would say also, have the same level of standards and expectations of the person with a disability as you would any other employee. Don't feel like, as Carlos used the term earlier, don't feel like you're doing charity work by hiring the person with a disability. You want to hire the best person for the job, but be open to that being the person with a disability. But again, we're always so careful when we're talking to employers and others, is that we want to make sure students with disabilities get access to opportunities, but that they're held to the same standards and level of expectations as any other employee would be. And finally, next slide, relative to accommodations, there's some terrific resources that are out there. And the best resource we could offer regarding accommodations for people with disabilities is the Job Accommodation Network, JAN. AskJan.org. Really encourage you to do a deep dive on that website. It's very comprehensive with a wonderful overview of possible accommodations by all kinds of types of disabilities. So it's a terrific resource relative to accommodations. And with that, we'll go to the final slide. And in the final few minutes here, we will open up for any questions that you may have for us. David, I'll ask you to maybe jump in as well.
Thank you, Larry. Yes, and again, we'll just invite you all. Feel free to use either the Q&A or the chat. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to make right now, we'll take a look at those and respond in the time that we have. It's a lot to take in, isn't it?
David, as we have the awkward silence as we're waiting for people to post, you want to talk a little bit about the resource handout that you mentioned?
Sure. And again, Brianna is going to make that available to you along with these slides. You'll just see a range of information there about accessibility, about interviewing practices, about accommodations, assistive technology. We hope that Hope's conversation with Carlos really sort of drilled down and took a lot of the mystery around it, perhaps from that topic. So we'll hope that those resources give you all lots of additional information beyond what's on the AskJan website. And that again, whether you're working with interns before graduation or graduates after they obtain their degree work, we thank you for the inclusive comments and attitudes you expressed at the beginning, in just seeing as Larry and Carlos have both emphasized, hire the qualified individual who can perform the essential job functions first and foremost. If they happen to have a disability, that might simply be a bonus by enriching what they bring to the table in terms of problem solving, lived experience, creativity. But we hope today's conversation just gives you additional ways to think about some of these complex topics, and again, access to lots of resources to help you do the great work that you're doing even better moving forward.
Okay. I haven't seen any questions come in through chat or Q&A. Oh, one just popped in. David, are you able to see that?
I am. I'm seeing Jamie's chat. What are your recommendations for addressing situations where an employee has a recently diagnosed disability and is not yet proficient with assistive technology? For example, needs to use a screen reader, but ramp up training for that time has been reported to be approximately 1 year. Great question. As you would with any other employee who needs to develop a skill to do their job well, think about how you would handle that with anybody. In the case of the person with a disability and technology-related needs, they may qualify to become a voc rehab client, a federal agency that can provide that training outside of the office. Your HR department might know of other resources. You might have other employees who have that skill set already and are happy to share that information or guidance with the employee in question. You might need to shift some of their responsibilities if possible to give them a little bit more time to develop that AT competency in order to take back on the full responsibilities once they have that skill set. There are a couple of Q&A questions as well. Amber wrote, we like to seek out diverse workforce of engineers. Do you have any tips for seeking out individuals with disabilities? Great question, Amber. I assume you're looking for resources about, maybe STEM majors or engineers in particular with disabilities. Offhand, one doesn't come to mind
So
that is that specific. Carlos
if
or Larry, do you?
yeah, I just so just real quick, I know we're short on time. I know, the typical routes that employers use to recruit students from colleges is career fairs. However, oftentimes those are really challenging environments for students with disabilities. But every college campus has an office of that handles accommodations for students with disabilities on their campus. So perhaps including them as ways to collaborate with career services to get the word out for students with disabilities could be an avenue. Just a thought there.
Totally agree with Carlos. You may be working with career services, have them connect with the disability office on campus to where maybe the disability office could get the word specifically out to students with disabilities who are engineering majors and have some kind of, you come to campus for an open house presentation to those students. So again, knowing students with disabilities, not accessing career services at the rates that others do, maybe working in collaboration with the disability services office could be helpful.
We'll wrap up. Vivian has also posted. One of the recs was to wait for the individual to mention a disability or request accommodations, but also given the fact that people may be reluctant to disclose, particularly in the interview setting, how to balance these two. What a great conundrum that we all grapple with. And particularly in these times, people may be more reluctant to disclose a disability. It is the right of the individuals we all know not to disclose unless they need to or perceive that there be a need to. The best answer I can offer is to do everything you can, which I'm sure you already are doing, Vivian, to create a workspace that is inviting of disclosure, where people with disabilities feel safe and respected and acknowledged. In a previous generation, we learned how to be more accepting of the LGBTQ community, more responsive to people, who are queer, transgendered, bi, and make the workplace safer for them to come out and be themselves fully there as well. The same attitude can answer your question here too, starting with how you write up your job description, how you put information on your website about your workplace culture, how you conduct interviews, to just proactively say, we invite disclosure if it's helpful or necessary in order to access accommodations, to have equal access, to be able to perform your job. So anything you can do proactively to just let the potential or current employee know that it's okay to disclose in order to request accommodations will go a long way toward inviting them to do so. I hope that's helpful.
All right, I'm going to jump back in. I think this is a good time to wrap up the session. A couple of thank yous. Thank you so much for our 3 colleagues from the Ferry Box Center for presenting and also giving us some materials that we can forward along. And thank you to all of you employers who are interested in this space and took time to attend today. We will try to follow up with you via email with some additional resources that you might find helpful. Thank you all. Have a great day.